I think a lot of data teams run into the problem of, creating metrics within their BI tool, and then you have three different answers for the same question. The idea of a flywheel is to put in the same amount of input, but then continually 10x your output.
Welcome to the Analytics Heroes podcast by ModernData101, the one and only platform for all things data products and purpose-driven analytics. My name is Abhyuday Verma, Community Manager at Modern, and I'll be your host. Today I am honored to host Madison Schott, a top analytics voice modernizing the analytics stack across companies in banking, consumer goods, and marketing domains to help transition from data-informed to data-driven states. Currently, she is playing the role of Senior Modern Data Stack Engineer at ConvertKit. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the show. To get started with, so if you could talk a little bit about your recent projects and the work you have been doing at your organization.
So I'm currently an analytics engineer at ConvertKit, which is a creator platform where you can sell products, create newsletters, really just do a lot to educate and reach out to your audience. So we are a data team of 5, so pretty small. A lot of my projects revolve around reverse ETL and making sure that I'm sending high quality data to HubSpot and Intercom, because a lot of our sales and communication processes revolve around those two platforms. And then I work very closely with DBT. Right now I'm working on creating a whole new revenue model. So that's been a lot of research into Stripe data, which is quite complex and definitely a beast to work with. So I've kind of at those initial stages of just learning about all the intricacies of Stripe with ConvertKit, and then coming up with a plan to model. So I think with DBT, it's really easy to kind of just use the tool without using it correctly. I think that's the thing that I see a lot of people doing wrong, is not taking the time to understand the benefits of it and how to properly set it up before diving into it. And that's something that I've realized with basically every role that I've had, is you really need to take the time to understand your data and the foundational aspects, and then build on top of that using the best practices, or you can just get yourself into a worse situation than you started with, building up all this tech debt and then having to fix these issues on top of building for the future.
I read about an article about your shift left approach, and you recently discussed it relating to the business logic. So can you elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah, so shifting left in the context of data mainly refers to taking all of the insights and the metrics out of your BI tool or your end systems like HubSpot or Intercom, and moving them as far upstream as possible. So if you're using a tool like DBT, instead of calculating metrics within your BI tool, you would calculate it within DBT instead. And this allows you to create a single source of truth, and then be able to use that one metric calculation in a bunch of different tools. I think a lot of data teams run into the problem of, creating metrics within their BI tool, creating metrics within something like HubSpot, maybe another growth or marketing tool like Google Analytics. And then you have 3 different answers for the same question, and it just makes stakeholders lose trust in the data because they don't understand why there's 3 different answers for the same question. They don't know what to depend on. So by shifting all of this logic left, you can really create one central source of truth.
As you can see, the next question is about AI ML, but I'll ask you a different question before that. As you mentioned that you're really interested into the modern data stack. So, for its sheer size, governance is always at the top of the agenda for most data leaders. In your opinion, has the modern data stack helped the case or added more fuel to the fire?
I think it's a lot easier to just kind of put something in place, which is good and bad, because sometimes maybe people that don't really understand data quality best practices are taking advantage of these modern data stack tools. But as long as you have the right foundations, it can be really powerful. And it can be just like as simple as before you're using a data warehouse, like make sure you write up documentation on how you're planning to use it, like the different databases, the different schemas, the users, the roles that you want to create. And this can really help make sure that you have good data governance. I think a lot of times data governance goes south when people aren't documenting things and you're kind of just acting quickly and like giving stakeholders access to data whenever they request it without really thinking out why you're giving it to them or documenting the fact that you're giving it to them. And then you just end up with a bunch of different people who have access to your data that are then maybe using it to do their own calculations and aren't necessarily correct. I know that's definitely a problem we have where we've almost given too much access to the data, and then it empowers stakeholders to find the answers themselves, which is good to an extent, but if they don't really know how to use SQL or understand all of the nuances in the data, then it can, again, like create that distrust.
Yeah, definitely, right? You need to have that element of the emotion sorted whenever you are working with data. Whoever you're asking the data about, it ultimately comes down to that trust factor.
Is very easy to lose too. I feel like once you lose it as a data team, it's really hard to gain it back. So you want to do everything to protect that as much as possible.
That was a really nice answer. Thank you for that. And right now we can move to AI/ML. So are you required to or have had the opportunity to imbibe about AI/ML in your day-to-day work?
So I haven't really used AI. I think AI is such a buzz topic right now, and I do think it's powerful, but I do think many companies and teams aren't really at the place where they should be using it. I know for us personally, like we're just trying to build the foundational data models and still like understanding and documenting all of our data and that should be done before using any of these other tools. And I think a lot of companies kind of dive in before fully understanding the quality of their data. And if you're not properly cleaning it and you're using AI on data that's messy and unreliable, it's just going to make the issue worse because you can't debug it in a way that you can if you're the one that has full control over it.
Many people are experimenting right now. The result. I was also attending the CDO IQ. So there also people were not really confident about how AI is working on their data. Is it actually correct? Are they getting the right results? All these questions are still popping
If
up.
anything, I think you can maybe utilize AI to kind of like help speed up your workflow, but I don't think it should necessarily replace like analytics engineers or data engineers, like using simply like chat GDP to look up like specific queries or like to optimize your queries or looking up different concepts that you might need like a better grasp on. I think that's definitely a better way to approach it from an engineering aspect right now.
We came across this very interesting concept on your Substack. What's the Analytics Engineering Flywheel?
So this is something that the CEO and founder of ConvertKit, Nathan Barry, talks a lot about, and something that we've really tried to implement a lot at ConvertKit is this idea of a flywheel. So it's essentially like normally if your input directly affects your output. The idea of a flywheel is to put in the same amount of input but then continually like 10x your output, so you're essentially doing less and less work with more and more results. So with analytics engineering specifically, I think of this a lot as like taking the time to really understand the problem before you jump into it, and looking at like all potential solutions, all potential problems that could go wrong, and then really taking the time to document everything. I think documentation is something that a lot of people don't want to spend the time to do because it is very time consuming. You have to write a lot of investigative queries. You have to ask a lot of people questions that have like more of the historical knowledge, especially if you're like newer at a company. But once you document everything, it then allows you to move a lot faster because you document a data source once and then you can continually build on that and use it rather than trying to understand it every time you want to use it. So first understand your problem, then document, test, do all that kind of investigative work, and then writing your data models. Writing data models in general will help speed up any kind of analytics workflow because you're writing reusable data sets and you're giving analysts a way to like query this transformed data so they don't have to write it every time. And then the last step is something like a PR review where your team can review your data modeling logic, and then you can continually iterate. So after the PR, then you can go back to, okay, is this model actually solving the problem that I initially scoped it out to be, and then reiterating on it. And then this process just continually moves faster and faster because you're building up that foundation within your data warehouse with lots of documentation that you can reuse in the future. Any way to work less and have more results, I think, is definitely appreciated, especially because data teams have so much requests flying at them. So to be able to answer more and more requests with like the core things that you've built is a really powerful thing.
It's a really nice logic you're trying to help a lot of people with, a lot of people in understanding how analytics is much easier than they think through your newsletters as well, which are really interesting. I have the basics. What are things you'd love to work on as a data engineer?
I've always really enjoyed math. Math was always my favorite subject growing up. So I think analytics engineering is very similar to solving a math problem, which I like because there's like so many little pieces and things that you have to consider and like little edge cases, and there's not really a correct or one way of doing things. It's about like getting to that end solution. And everyone can kind of solve things in their own way, which I think is fun. And then I also just really enjoy like working directly with business stakeholders because I know like the work that I'm doing is directly having value on the business. And I think it's definitely more motivating to see like the work that you're doing and how it impacts all the other people within the company. And then I just love trying like new modern data stack tools. There's always something new that's out there. And I think it's really fun because it's such a fast growing industry and there's always something new and people constantly improving what's already been built. And that's just a lot of fun to do.
What are some must-have skills and tools you recommend to in a data engineer's arsenal?
So I think first is SQL. That's like a must-have for any data person. I don't think you can ever be too good or practice SQL too much. There's always like a special use case that comes along, and specifically like for me, I used to use Snowflake as like my data warehouse of choice. And then moving to ConvertKit, we use Redshift. And I've had to tweak my SQL skills a lot because there's just like functions that you can do within Snowflake that you can't do within Redshift. So it's definitely taught me a lot working in like a different data warehouse. And then I think looking at like what it takes to build a data pipeline is a really helpful place to start. So I actually have a challenge coming out in my newsletter called Data Pipeline Somewhere, where I'm teaching you how to build a data pipeline from scratch. So we're going to look at how to set up a data warehouse, how to ingest data using Airbyte, how to transform it using dbt, and then how to orchestrate it using Prefect. And I think all of those different pieces are very foundational for a data engineer. So like you have to know basic data modeling skills. Again, that like comes back to SQL and dbt. You have to understand like how data is flowing in and out of your warehouse. And then orchestration is super important. And I think I recommend focusing more on like the foundations of each of those pieces rather than like a specific tool, because I think they can be applied to pretty much any tool that you use. I think if you know one tool in each of those categories, then you can kind of learn them all, which is a cool thing to be able to take like those foundational skills and apply them to every modern data stack
Okay,
tool.
so when I find this very interesting, when exploring these new tools, how can data engineers assess their fitness for their projects? Because could you share an example of a recent tool you evaluated and your decision-making process behind its adoption and rejection, whatever it was?
Yeah, so we recently were looking at different data ingestion tools, specifically for Stripe data and revenue reporting that I mentioned earlier. Um, and I guess a few things that we were looking at, cost is always number one. Like more enterprise tools tend to be like, better. They're more reliable. They have lots of
Yeah.
support team behind them. Ways to like quality check, but they are very expensive. So like one of those was Fivetran, for example. In an ideal world, we would have gone with Fivetran because it's just a very reliable tool, and I've always had good experience, but it is very expensive. So that's like one thing. I try to always look for tools like within the company's budget first. And then the second thing is, do they have like what you need available? Do they solve the use case? So like we were looking for a connector to ingest Stripe data. So if a tool doesn't ingest Stripe data, there's no point in using it. And then I always look at like if the company is following best practices. So like with data ingestion, how are they handling schema propagation? How are they handling normalization? And these are all things that I talk about in my new series coming up as well, when exploring data ingestion tools. And then lastly, like a tool can look good on paper and like check all the boxes, but I think you just need to always try it out for yourself. Like I would never commit to a tool without actually trying it. So like one of the tools, for example, we were looking at, we thought it was going to be like really good and work well for us. And then when it came to actually using it, it just wasn't ingesting the data at the speed that we needed. And there was just a lot of features that were falling short, and we felt like the data wasn't reliable. So in the end, we decided not to go with it. But I think trialing these tools is honestly always key because you're going to get the best feel for it. And I always recommend like comparing it to like doing proper data validation. You don't want to just assume everything is correct, even if the tool is like saying the ingestion syncs are working correctly. Like try to compare multiple tools at once if you can, and see what the data looks like in one versus the other versus what's already in your warehouse.
So the next one, given DBT is one of the favorites for data engineers, so what are the top pros and cons you've experienced so far?
DBT like exceeds any other transformation tool out there, but the one con I would say is just, I guess, the lack of governance. Like you don't necessarily, DBT doesn't always enforce certain best practices. So it is easy to kind of like use the tool in a way that it's not necessarily meant for. So I think like you just have to be conscious of setting it up the right way. DBT has a lot of great resources. I've written so many resources on how to correctly use the tool. I go over this a lot in my foundational course that I have from Maven, like just going over like what modularity means, for example. Like that's the main benefit of DBT, is making everything modular. And I find that a lot of people don't use it in that way. In terms of pros though, I love that DBT has built-in documentation. I think that's one of the most valuable things, to have your documentation right beside your code and to just make it so easy to find. And same with testing. Like DBT has so many different testing options. They have tons of packages that have been built on top of DBT for data quality that you can use. And it's an open source tool, so anyone can have access to DBT, which is a huge plus. And there's just so much that you can do with it. Just the way it automates everything, like with macros, with seeds, you really just have like all these abilities to do everything within the tool that you don't really get with any other data
The
transformation.
legacy models, which were really quite hard to work with. And what are some of the modeling techniques or best practices you advocate or would like to advocate in your team for these models?
Yeah, so in my first role as an analytics engineer, we had a bunch of data models that were written within Domo by like a consulting company, and they were improperly named. They were referencing like each other in weird orders using awful SQL practices, like pretty much as bad as you can imagine it. And I think I spent a lot of time trying to understand what those models were doing, whereas I instead should have just started from scratch and not even referenced those models. Um, I know that's easier said than done because you have a lot of like stakeholders asking you questions based off of these models. But in the end, it does just create like a more robust data model because you really don't know if that logic in the model still applies or if those data sources are still used. So by starting from scratch, you can kind of begin that whole like flywheel process all over. So like talking with the stakeholders, seeing what they actually need, what they actually use. That's like another thing. Just because there's a model for it doesn't mean anyone's actually using what's in it. So starting from scratch and just documenting everything that you're doing and the reasoning that you're doing it. Legacy models often don't have documentation, which makes it harder. So by starting from scratch and like understanding all of your data sources, all of the weird edge cases, and understanding exactly what you're trying to build, it's just ends up being a lot more reliable and less of a headache because you're not trying to understand code that's been poorly written.
If you had to use an analogy to stress the importance of data models in any organization, what would that be?
That's a good question. I mean, I would say it's like data models just enable, I guess maybe you can think of it as like a puzzle. Instead of the individual pieces, you can see like the full picture in a data model, and you don't have to spend time putting those small pieces together. The analysts can just look at the data model as the full picture and get what they need without spending all the time putting the puzzle pieces together.
So you wrote a very popular piece on Snowflake warehouse a couple of years ago. So how was the platform? How has it evolved? And what are some top optimistic optimization hacks or tips do you recommend now?
Snowflake has really become like an all-in-one data platform. Like I swear every few months they're adding like another major feature, which I don't use Snowflake as much anymore. I miss it. I wish I still used it compared to Redshift. But yeah, like now they have Snowpark where you can use Python and Java and not just SQL. They have the ability to create LLMs. Like you really can do so much within Snowflake. I think the biggest thing, just like managing costs, I've used Snowflake for like my own personal development projects. And I'll never forget like one time I left a warehouse running and I think I had a bill for like $2,000 the next day, which is not fun, but it also makes you appreciate like these cost hacks and how you can save money. And it just, when you do something like that, it makes you way more aware of how much you're spending in a tool like Snowflake. So I think like nowadays there's a lot of modern data stack tools that have been built on top of Snowflake specifically for cost management, which I think those are really cool tools that you can take advantage of. So I definitely recommend looking at those. And then I think just like the basics of creating a bunch of different warehouses depending on what you're doing and using those to track the costs that you're running up. I think if you use just like one or two warehouses within Snowflake, it's really hard to pinpoint what is bringing those costs up. So by creating like different warehouses for your transformation, for your analysts, for your ingestion tools, it's easy to see what's spending the most and then specifically targeting that.
Right? So the community is a buzz, the word is everywhere, and semantics and a dedicated logical modeling layer. This is people are really talking about this. So what are your thoughts on semantic engineering or semantic models?
Yeah, I think semantic engineering can be super helpful, especially with like creating that single source of truth that I mentioned earlier. Like DBT has a semantic layer that allows you to create metrics based off of different dimensions and allows them to easily be queried by analysts. I think this is always going to be a huge problem that metric calculations get caught up in the BI layer. So DBT is just adding another tool to the DBT toolkit that allows you to shift things left.
Yeah.
And yeah, it can be super powerful. I think you do need to make sure you have those foundational data models in place, though, before you can really take advantage of this and do things the right way. So just like everything else, it's like a series of steps that you need to make sure you have the foundation, have the high quality data and data models and the testing before you can implement it.
Have data catalogs made the lives of data engineers simpler in terms of resolving file
Yeah,
duplications?
so I'm a big fan of data catalogs, but I think it is hard to get stakeholders to actually use them. Like, if you're going to answer their question in Slack, for example, why would they take the time to look through a data catalog? So, while data catalogs are powerful, I think it's more so of like a cultural shift that you have to focus on to actually get stakeholders to use them and look for the answers themselves within these tools. And that requires a lot of education also on how to use them and making sure you're setting them up in a way that stakeholders find valuable.
Have you heard about or worked with data products yet?
Yeah, I guess I think there's a lot of buzzwords that come out in the data community, and data products is one of those. I think you can kind of look at anything that a data engineer produces as a data product. I think data products are used like more so in a business sense. Like you would look at a BI tool as a business product or a data product. But yeah, I haven't spent too much time like looking into it because I feel like it's another one of those buzzwords that just kind of encompasses everything almost. It's like people giving a name to something that's existed for like 20 years. Look at it as data product as like the very end stage, like almost something that an analyst more so creates. So I think like with data engineers, it's more so setting the foundation and like producing high quality data and data models with
Okay.
along with documentation that then can
Uh,
eventually be like used downstream.
does your team consume whatever artifact they try to create and how they try to deliver business value? How are you currently doing this?
So we're using QuickSight. Our data analysts will create like dashboards and reports based off of the data models that we create using QuickSight, and then stakeholders typically reference that.
Last question of this lot, your go-to resources. So about the communities, about the resources which you read and which you found useful in your early days or even today, and for staying updated about the latest developments in the analytics tools and
So I love Medium articles. I think Medium is really helpful for finding like very specific answers and just like thought style pieces of what other data engineers in the industry are trying out. So I love going there for tech advice. And then I write frequently on LinkedIn. So I love following like other data influencers. Like Zach Wilson is a great one for engineering, and he also has a data engineering boot camp. The Seattle data guy has really interesting articles. And I love reading newsletters too. And then I think an underappreciated or underthought of resource is just like Slack channels. Like DBT has its own Slack channel. Most like modern data stack tools will have their own Slack channels, and you can find really interesting things in there. And I always feel like I'm reading something that I didn't know because there's just like super experts in those tools that are in those Slack
how do
channels.
you maintain a healthy work-life balance while keeping up the fun at work?
So I think I've always been pretty good at work-life balance. I think I set like pretty hard like boundaries, I guess. Like for me, for example, like my morning workouts are really important to me. So I always make sure to block out my calendar with like things that I know are going to help my mental health and help me like show up as the best version of myself at work. And I think when you make sure that you are integrating those things in your life that like you really need, then it's easier to show up and, show up as your best self and have fun. I think a lot of people feel like they need to be working all the time or they need to like once 9 to 5 hits, like you have to just completely dedicate yourself to your work. But a lot of times, like going for walks or exercising is going to make you way more productive, way more focused. And by taking care of yourself, you can produce your best work. So I think like not being shy about that, being vocal about what you need as a person is super important.
Definitely. And we really love how you're artistic with those posters in your newsletters
Love
as well.
learning. So whenever I learn something new, like it's fun for me. I try to make work as fun as possible because I am constantly learning something new. So it is exciting.
And that brings us to the motivation part because if you're not motivated, then you always try to lag behind and skip something, procrastinate about things. So some recent feel good moments, one was your road trip, I remember, and keeping you joyful and motivated. What are those things for you?
Yeah, so I think being outside and active is really important to me. So I always try to go for walks. I'm by the beach right now, so going to the beach as much as possible is always really nice. And yeah, just being active. Like before this call, I went to a yoga and Pilates class, and that's always fun. I love to hike when I'm back home in Arizona. Just like being outside in nature makes me feel really good. And then I love cooking too. That's kind of like my one of my hobbies that keeps me sane after work. Like after work, I just don't want to be on the computer at all. And like I need something to kind of just decompress, and being creative with what I cook helps me do that. I also like to garden, so growing my own like flowers and vegetables and then using that in meals is really fun. And then I've also been taking an art class recently, creating stained glass. So every Thursday night, I've been going to a stained glass class. And that's like another thing that, again, is like getting me off the computer, helping me be creative. And that's been a lot of fun.
Nice. I really am fond of cooking myself a little bit. I'm not a professional of it, so I tried baking myself. So that baking incident didn't go as well. I put in a lot more salt than I should have in that brownie, and my mom was really out of the place. So I really like to bake, but there are problems in the way which I'm trying to reduce. So yeah, learning keeps me handy.
Yeah, I'm definitely a better chef than I am a baker. Baking
Uh,
is because I don't like measuring things. So
Right. Coming to the last one, this is really important because you, as a data engineer, have also started teaching other people, or sharing things with other people with your newsletter, with your experience coming on this call and going on multiple occasions. So, some goals and aspirations you've set for yourself, and what are some hobbies that are helping you to keep at that goal and aspiration in your work, in your personal life? How do you do it?
yeah, so I think one of my big goals, I'd love to write a book someday. I don't know if it'll be data related or like I love reading memoirs, so I think that would be cool. I don't know exactly what I would write about my life yet to turn it into a memoir, but I do love writing in general and I love reading, so I think that would be really cool. I would definitely love to do that someday. And then just like continue growing my newsletter, and just learning more and more and just like becoming better in my craft. I think I'm someone where I really enjoy learning and always want to become better today than I was yesterday. And that's kind of like in every aspect of my life, like with my fitness goals, with cooking, like just learning like a new technique is fun. becoming better at gardening, like just taking everything and learning more and being able to grow from it. And I think embracing failure and just trying new things is super important in that. You can't be scared of it, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to help you grow the most in any aspect.
So thank you for giving such a wonderful advice for all the people who are going to listen to this interview. And definitely they're going to take back something, not just data related, but also something helpful which will motivate them for being their own self. Thank you for joining us on season 1 of Analytics Heroes. For more information, visit ModernData101.com, or you can also find us Analytics Heroes on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. Click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And on behalf of the team here at Modern, thanks for listening.